In Patty Cannon's criminal empire, the sound of a baby crying was not a cause for concern. It was a nuisance, a risk, and every risk had to be eliminated permanently. One witness recounted how she once hit a screaming baby over the head with a piece of firewood until the sound died away. Another described carrying a sickly infant out of the house in her apron, never to be seen again. These are not fabricated ghost stories. These are chilling testimonies recorded in court documents, revealing the face of one of the most brutal female demons in American history, Martha Patty Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, under the guise of a frontier widow, Patty built and ran a hellish machine that became known as the Reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike the slave rescue route, Patty's network was a one-way street to despair. It preyed on African Americans who had won their freedom and escaped slaves, only to sell them back to a life of humiliation on southern plantations. But human trafficking is only part of the story. Patty Cannon was also a serial killer. The official tally for which she was charged was 4 murders. But those who knew her whispered that the real number was more than 20. Her victims included everyone: competitors, witnesses, and innocent children who were seen as burdens. She turned her farm into a mass grave, a graveyard of nameless, anonymous bodies. For 20 years, the empire operated almost perfectly in the shadows, protected by lax laws and the indifference of a racist society. It seemed that these crimes would be buried forever along with their victims. Until one fateful spring day in 1829, when a horse accidentally broke the seal of hell. In a field near the Delaware, Maryland border, a farmer was going about his daily chores. Suddenly, his plow horse stumbled and let out a panicked whinny. The farmer rushed to the scene. He thought it was just a hole. But when his shovel hit something hard, a dull, hollow sound rang out. It was not a rock. He dug around hurriedly, and an old wooden chest gradually appeared. For a moment, human greed arose. Was this treasure buried by pirates, or the property of some wealthy family? With trembling hands, he pried open the rotten lid. A foul odor rose, and any hope of gold or silver vanished, replaced by a sight of horror. Inside was a human skeleton, twisted and yellowed with age. The fractures on the skull were undeniable evidence of a brutal attack. It was more than just a skeleton. It was the first victim ever found. It was the first voice to emerge from the mass grave that Patty Cannon had created on her own land. The discovery sparked a massive investigation that tore through every inch of the earth, exposing layers of a crime that had been hidden for 2 decades. 6 more sets of remains were found, including 3 children. Today, we're not just going to recount a case. We're going to dissect the mind of a demon, investigate a deeply ingrained system of evil, and find out how one woman was able to wreak such terror for so long. If you're ready to face the darkest and most naked truth, give this video a like. The journey into Patty Cannon's empire officially begins. How could a monster in human form like Patty Cannon survive and operate with impunity for 2 decades? How could an empire built on blood and tears operate so smoothly in the heart of America? The answer lies not in the cruelty of one individual. It lies in the land, the times, and the society that created her. Every monster needs a den, and in the early 19th century, America unwittingly created the perfect den for Patty Cannon. Look at the map. The land Patty chose for her lair is located on the Delmarva Peninsula, right at that strange intersection. It doesn't belong anywhere. It's the junction of 3 different jurisdictions, Delaware's Sussex County and Maryland's Caroline and Dorchester counties. It's a literal gray zone on the legal map. For a criminal, it's paradise. If a sheriff from Delaware is chasing you, you just have to cross an invisible line in the ground into Maryland, and the sheriff loses all authority. They can only watch you disappear. Patty Cannon and her gang exploited this deadly loophole. They turned state lines into protective shields for crime. The land itself seemed built for secrecy. There were no bustling towns or busy roads. It was a remote countryside with miles of dense pine and oak forests cut by rivers and murky swamps. Farms were isolated, miles apart. Neighbors might not see each other for weeks. In such an environment, who would hear a cry for help? Who would notice a strange carriage driving by at night? Isolation was Patty Cannon's greatest ally. It allowed her to build secret bunkers, locking dozens of people under her feet without anyone knowing. The background music adds rhythm, suggesting economic change and need. Illustrations of cotton plantations, cotton gins, and slave trading ports. But a lawless land is not enough. There must be a motive, a reason big enough to make people willingly throw away their humanity. And that motive is money. Lots and lots of money. In 1808, the U.S. Congress passed a landmark law banning the importation of slaves from Africa. In theory, it was a humane move, but in practice, it had an unintended and horrifying effect. The demand for labor on the giant cotton plantations of the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, rather than diminish, it exploded after the invention of the cotton gin. Cotton became king, white gold. And to get white gold, they needed slave labor. When supplies from Africa were cut off, a domestic black market emerged. The price of a healthy slave skyrocketed. From around $300, it could now be over $40,000, a real fortune at the time. Human greed was pushed to the limit, and it gave way to a new, more sinister breed of criminal, the human hunter. People like Patty Cannon didn't need to sail to Africa. Their supply was right here, on American soil. And who were the easiest targets? Free African Americans living in border states like Delaware and Maryland. They were a painful paradox of history. They were not slaves, but they were not truly free either. Their freedom was on a piece of paper that could be stolen, burned, or simply ignored. They did not have the right to vote. They were not allowed to testify against whites in court. If a white man attacked or kidnapped them, their word was virtually worthless in court. They had to carry papers with them at all times, and lived in constant fear that at any moment, anyone could accuse them of being runaway slaves. Their disappearances were rarely seriously investigated. To the white power system of the time, they were second-class people, invisible beings. Social indifference was the final, most fertile soil for Patty Cannon's evil seeds to germinate. So we have the perfect recipe for hell: a land without law, an economic engine fueled by insatiable greed, and a group of victims unprotected by law and society. The ground is ready. The engine is fueled. Now all that is needed is a driver ruthless enough, intelligent enough, and evil enough to start the machine of evil. And that driver is about to appear on the stage of history. The land was ready. The economic engine was fueled. The legal loopholes were wide open. The stage for hell was set. All that was needed was a protagonist ruthless enough to take the stage. And then she appeared. Unlike any 19th century image of a woman, her name was Martha, but she was known as Patty Cannon. Even her origins were shrouded in mist. Court records put her birth around 1760, but where or under what circumstances, no one knew for sure. Rumor had it she was born in Canada as Lucretia Patricia Hanley, then emigrated to America. Patty kept her past hidden, like a predator covering her tracks. She understood that a person without a past had nothing to lose. She moved to the Delmarva frontier, married a local farmer named Jesse Cannon, and had at least one daughter. On the surface, they were a normal farming family, living a quiet life like everyone else, growing corn and tobacco. Their modest two-story house looked indistinguishable. It was the perfect cover. Because behind the door of that seemingly ordinary house a shadow, a monster was taking shape. In the wild world of the frontier, where men ruled by brute force, Patty Cannon was not prey. She was the apex predator. Contemporary accounts describe her as a woman of astonishing stature, nearly 6 feet 1 inch tall, an extraordinary height for a woman of her time. Her body was muscular and hard, possessing a physical strength that many men feared. Her voice was said to be deep and authoritative, capable of quelling any argument. And her eyes, it is said, had a piercing gaze that left those she confronted feeling undressed. Patty Cannon broke every gender norm of the time. While other women stayed in the kitchen, she rode horses, drank, and cursed like a man. She didn't play by anyone's rules, she made her own. Violence was her language. Anyone who crossed her line, gang member or outsider, was met with terrible wrath. And then, around 1826, her husband, Jesse Cannon, died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. It was whispered that Patty had poisoned him. Whatever the truth, Jesse's death marked a turning point. Patty Cannon was no longer a farmer's wife. She was a widow in control of her property, her land, and most importantly, her own dark destiny. She had been freed from the last shackles of society. The monster is now completely free. Patty's first step in building her empire was not a robbery or a murder, but something much more calculated and cold. She used her own daughter as a tool. Her daughter's marriages became criminal alliances. Her first husband, Henry Britton, was a slave kidnapper. He taught Patty the first tricks of the trade, but Britton was too inexperienced. He was caught and later hanged. The death of his son-in-law did not frighten Patty. On the contrary, it taught her a valuable lesson. Single crimes are easy to detect. To survive, you need an organization, a system. And then her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson. This was no petty criminal. Johnson was a shrewd businessman, someone who understood logistics and profit. He brought Patty not only experience but also capital and an invaluable asset, a tavern that straddled the Delaware, Maryland border. Johnson's Tavern became the headquarters, the beating heart of the criminal network. The combination of Patty's vicious intelligence and Johnson's business acumen created a two-headed monster. They were no longer amateur kidnappers. They were running a professional human trafficking business, a factory of suffering. From a woman of unknown origin, Patty Cannon has transformed herself into the uncrowned queen of this lawless land. She is the terror, the law, the judge. Now, with a secure base, a business partner, and a burgeoning criminal network, Patty Cannon is ready to set her infernal machine in motion. And in the next part, we will look directly inside that machine to see how it operates horribly. Every empire needs a capital, a center of power. And the capital of Patty Cannon's empire is a seemingly ordinary tavern located in a place called Johnson's Cross, at least above ground. Patty's son-in-law Joe Johnson's tavern was a masterpiece of crime. Its location couldn't have been more perfect. The house straddled the Delaware, Maryland state line, which meant that different rooms in the house were literally in different jurisdictions. When the Delaware police raided, Patty and her gang could have simply walked from the living room to the kitchen and crossed the border into Maryland, beyond the reach of the law. For wary travelers, this tavern was a legitimate stop. They could eat, drink, rest, and catch up on news. The upper floor was a regular business, providing the perfect cover, explaining the constant flow of people and carriages. But that's just the surface. The basement of the tavern was the true heart of the empire. It was not a cellar. It was a private prison, a machine designed to crush human dignity and will. Secret passages were hidden behind false walls. Dark, damp cells were dug deep underground, soundproofed to the point that no screams could escape. Iron rings were fastened to the stone walls, ready to chain the victims. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and despair. The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of candlelight when the jailers brought food, usually just moldy bread and water. This was a transit point, a warehouse for storing human cargo before they were transported south. To run such a complex machine, Patty Cannon needed a team. Her gang was not a ragtag group of thugs. It was organized like a business, with members having clear roles and functions. There were brutal white criminals who carried out robberies and escorts. But Patty's secret weapons were her African, American, and mixed-race members. One of the most effective was John Purnell, a mixed-race man described in the dossier as a chameleon. He could blend in with both black and white communities. To blacks, he posed as a brother, a fellow traveler, offering promises of better work far away. To whites, he was a broker, an informant. This versatility made Purnell the perfect scout and decoy. Sadly, the gang also forced the slaves they owned to join in kidnapping their own, creating a vicious cycle of betrayal and pain. The journey of a victim who fell into the hands of Patty Cannon often began with a promise. Imagine you are a free black father, struggling to make ends meet. A well-dressed stranger, perhaps Purnell, approaches you. He talks about job opportunities in Georgia, with high wages, enough to build a better future for your children. You may hesitate, but then hope overcomes fear. You allow your grown son or daughter to follow them, believing you are offering them a ticket out of poverty. Little do you know it is a death sentence, a one-way ticket to hell. Once they had gone far enough, the guide's kindly facade fell away, replaced by violence. The victims were bound, gagged, and thrown into wagons. After days of traveling in the dark, they were taken to Johnson's tavern and thrown into the cellar. That was when the real torture began. Victim Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old woman who was rescued, recounted her 5 months of horror in that dungeon. She spoke of constant fear, of choking cries, and of the hopelessness of knowing she was about to be sold. Here, the victims would be processed. Any documents that proved their free status were burned. Their names were erased. They would be given new slave names. Their clothes were stripped off. Anyone who resisted, anyone who still insisted they were free, would be brutally beaten until they accepted their new status. Patty's goal was not just to detain the body, her goal was to break the spirit, to completely erase their former selves. Once a sufficient cargo was assembled, the victims would be chained together, loaded onto waiting boats on the Nanticoke River, or crammed into covered wagons, and begin the final journey south. This is the Underground Railroad, a system so well organized, so ruthless, so efficient. It is the most hideous mockery of the quest for freedom. Can such a perfect machine of evil last forever? Or will its success and its bottomless greed sow the seeds of destruction? A perfect crime machine. An empire built on fear and hidden by loopholes in the law. Patty Cannon had reason to believe she was untouchable. But no empire lasts forever, and its success and its insatiable greed began to sow the first seeds of its destruction. Cracks began to appear, both outside and inside. Up north, in the bustling city of Philadelphia, there was a man who refused to turn a blind eye. His name was Joseph Watson, the city's mayor. Watson was a Quaker, a faith that valued equality and justice. When he received repeated reports of free black citizens of his city disappearing without a trace, he was determined to find out the truth. Mayor Watson was not like other local sheriffs who could be bribed or ignored. He was a persistent, systematic, and determined adversary. He began meticulously compiling missing persons files, interviewing victims' families, and following up on the thinnest leads. All roads seemed to point in one direction south, toward the lawless reaches of the Delmarva Peninsula. Watson turned his investigation into a crusade. He coordinated with the governor of Pennsylvania, pressured the authorities in Delaware and Maryland, and most important, he unleashed a weapon more powerful than guns, money. Watson offered a reward of $5,000, a huge sum at the time, equivalent to years of a laborer's wages, for any information leading to the kidnappers' capture. The wall of silence built by Patty Cannon's fear began to crumble. Those who had been silenced out of fear now began to consider how much their loyalty was worth. Faced with unprecedented pressure, Patty Cannon's response was not to hide or scale back her activities. No. Cornered, the monster became more dangerous. She believed the only way to protect the empire was to silence all threats. Paranoia began to gnaw. Anyone suspected of being a traitor, any witness who knew too much, was ruthlessly eliminated. Violence escalated to new levels. And it was in that paranoia that Patty made a fatal mistake, a decision born of greed and arrogance that sealed the fate of the entire gang. She decided to expand her target audience. Patty Cannon was used to wiping out lives that society deemed invisible. She made the terrible mistake of believing she could do the same to powerful white men. Her new target, other slave traders. These traffickers often traveled alone, carrying huge sums of cash to purchase their goods. For Patty, they were walking gold mines. Killing them would not only allow her to steal their money, but also eliminate her competition and seize the slaves they were transporting. Kill 3 birds with 1 stone, a perfect plan in theory. Back in 1820, a slave trader from Georgia passed through Patty's land. He had a large sum of money, probably tens of thousands of dollars. He stopped at Johnson's tavern, unaware that he had entered a tiger's den. Patty and his men welcomed him warmly. Wine was poured to the brim. Stories were told. They got him drunk, and they extracted information about his money and his rote. And then, when he was off guard, they struck. Quickly and brutally, his body was dumped in a trunk and buried in the backyard. All his money and property were taken. When asked, Patty simply said he had sailed south. Patty did this over and over again. She didn't realize that, in this world of prejudice, the color of a victim's skin could determine whether a case would be dropped or become a manhunt. Free people of color disappeared, and no one cared. But wealthy white businessmen disappeared, with families, business partners, creditors. They left indelible traces. Their disappearances raised questions that the authorities could not ignore. Patty Cannon's empire is bleeding now. The pressure of Mayor Watson's crusade in the North is growing, and her own white murder in the South is digging her own grave. The fearful whispers in the land are now being heard, and the skeletons buried beneath her farm are about to speak. The curtain is about to fall. Sometimes the greatest criminal empires don't fall because of a great battle or a complex investigation. They fall because of an accident, a misstep. And for Patty Cannon, it was a misstep. Spring of 1829. On the land that Patty had rented out to the world, a farmer was plowing. Suddenly his horse slipped and fell into a soft hole. When the farmer dug, he found the fateful wooden chest that we know about at the beginning of the story. Forensic tests quickly determined that the skeleton inside was most likely that of the Georgia slave trader who had mysteriously disappeared nearly a decade earlier. This was no longer hearsay. This was physical evidence. For the first time, the authorities had something tangible, a thread that could lead to an entire web of crime. The discovery gave them legal justification to do what they had long suspected: search Patty Cannon's entire estate. The investigation was no longer a one-man effort by Mayor Watson. It had become a coordinated interstate operation. Investigators, sheriffs, and outraged citizens descended on the area. They began digging, searching, determined to uncover every inch of the truth. But they needed someone to show them the way. They needed someone who knew the buried secrets. They needed someone from the inside. And then, in April 1829, they got him. His name was Cyrus James. Cyrus James is the most tragic and important piece of this story. He was not a willing criminal. He was a victim, a slave bought by Patty Cannon when he was 7 years old. He grew up in her house at the hands of a monster mother. Patty raised him, and she terrorized him, turning him into an unwilling tool in the gang's operations. He was forced to be bait, forced to participate in kidnappings, and most horrifyingly, forced to bury Patty's victims. He knew everything. He knew who died. He knew how they died. And he knew where they were buried. When he is captured by the authorities while trying to escape, Cyrus is faced with an impossible choice: remain silent to protect the man who ruined his life and face the gallows, or speak out to save himself and bring belated justice to the souls of the dead. In the small interrogation room, the young man who had been silenced by fear finally spoke, and every word he uttered was a hoe digging deeper into the grave of the Cannon Empire. Cyrus' testimony was earth-shattering. He recounted every murder he had witnessed in vivid detail. He described how Patty Cannon, Joseph Johnson, and their gang shot a Georgia slave trader to death at the dinner table. He described how they carried the body into a chest and buried it in a field. But that's just the beginning. Follow me, Cyrus told the investigators. He led them around the property, passing through seemingly innocuous spots. At a corner of the garden, he stopped and pointed to the ground. Here, he said, as a child. They dug it up and found the body of a mixed-race child. Cyrus said that Patty had killed the child because she suspected that the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. She was afraid that the truth would come out. Cyrus then led them to another location. 2 wooden boxes were found. Inside one were the remains of another child. Cyrus sobbed as he recounted that he had witnessed Patty beating the child to death with a piece of wood. The other box contained the bones of an adult man whom the gang believed to be a man of property and had killed for his money. Cyrus's testimony was corroborated in the most horrifying way. In real time, Each set of bones was an exclamation point to his story, painting a complete picture of Paddy Cannon's unbridled brutality. She was more than a human trafficker. She was a child-killing monster, a serial killer who turned her own backyard into a graveyard. With the bodies exhumed and the irrefutable testimony of living witnesses, the net was completely closed. There was no way back, no room for denial. The evidence was too clear. The two-decade-long game of hide and seek with justice is over. Now it is time for the Queen of the Borderlands to face the crimes she committed. With a series of bodies unearthed and Cyrus James's irrefutable testimony, the game was up. In April 1829, Queen Paddy Cannon, the woman who had been the terror and law of the land, was finally captured and taken to the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware. News spread like wildfire. People flocked to see the monster in the flesh. They expected to see a broken, frightened person, but they were wrong. On April 13, a grand jury of 24 white men returned a formal indictment. Martha Paddy Cannon was charged with 4 counts of murder, including the murders of an infant girl, a baby boy, an adult man, and a Negro boy. Each count carried the death penalty. The case was all but settled. The evidence was incontrovertible. Delmarva waited with bated breath. The trial of Paddy Cannon was expected to be the biggest legal event in state history, a show of justice where evil would finally be punished. But in her cell, Paddy Cannon showed no fear. Even at nearly 70, she was a formidable force. Prisoners described a large, strong woman whose mind was still sharp and defiant. She showed no remorse. On the contrary, she seemed confused and angry at being arrested. To Paddy, what she did was not a crime. It was business. Her black victims were not people. They were property, merchandise. In her final days, it seemed as if Paddy's defenses had collapsed. She began to talk. She bragged about her criminal career, casually admitting to her prison guards that she had killed at least 24 people. She described the murders the way a farmer would describe butchering a chicken, the cold, detached tone in which she described the taking of the lives of adults and children made even the most hardened of law enforcement officers shudder. There was no remorse, no tears, just the arrogance of a monster who believed herself above morality and the law. The entire state was waiting for her to face the gallows. Newspapers from Philadelphia to Baltimore were preparing to dispatch reporters. The families of the victims, who had suffered and lived in silence for years, were finally about to see justice. But Paddy Cannon had never let anyone else decide her fate, and she wasn't going to start now. On the morning of May 11, 1829, just 3 weeks before the fateful trial, a jailer was making his usual rounds. When he arrived at Paddy's cell, he found a scene of strange silence. The usually loud and defiant woman lay motionless on the floor. She was dead. The official cause of death was suicide by poison. A small vial was found hidden in her clothes, believed to contain arsenic. But how did the most heavily guarded prisoner come into possession of the poison? Did a sympathetic person slip it to her? Or had she shrewdly stored the medicine for weeks, biding her time? The mystery has never been fully solved. Paddy Cannon lived by her own rules, and she chose to die by her own rules. In one final act, she deprived justice of its right to judge her. She robbed the families of her victims of the satisfaction of seeing her face the dock. She rigged the gallows, taking countless secrets of her criminal network with her to the grave. The boss lady's death left the investigation at a dead end. Justice was never fully served. Her main accomplices, including her son-in-law Joseph Johnson, fled to the Deep South, disappearing into obscurity and never having to face justice for their crimes. In this tragic story, there was a glimmer of justice. Cyrus James, the young man whose testimony had toppled an empire, was released as a reward for his cooperation. The court recognized that he was also a victim. He was sent to Pennsylvania to start a new life, free from the ghost of the woman who had haunted his childhood. Paddy Cannon is dead, but her ghost and her criminal empire still haunt this land. Her death in prison is not the end. It is only the beginning of a dark legacy that will be told for generations to come. A criminal dies, but the evil they wrought does not. Paddy Cannon's death in prison ended a reign of terror. but it cannot erase the deep scars she left on America's land and history. Patty Cannon's legacy is both visible and invisible, and it continues to haunt us to this day. Physically, the fate of her body was as strange and macabre as her life. She was initially buried without ceremony in the prison cemetery. Years later, when the grounds were rezoned, her remains were moved to a grave for anonymous people. But the story doesn't end there. In a bizarre move, Patty Cannon's skull was separated from the rest of her skeleton. It has become a grisly display, passed around for more than a century. Most recently, in 1961, the skull of one of America's most brutal female serial killers was loaned to the Dover Public Library. There it sits, in a glass case, a silent, chilling reminder of a dark chapter that people are both curious to see and eager to forget. The land where she wrought her crimes bore an indelible scar. The name, Johnson's Crossroads, became synonymous with kidnapping and murder. Years later, the town was renamed Reliance, a desperate attempt to wash away the past and rebuild trust. But the ghost of Patty Cannon still looms large. Intangibly, Patty Cannon's legacy is much larger. Her story is more than a true crime. It's a painful history lesson. First, it exposes the systematic brutality of slavery. The Underground Railroad is a dark, horrifying reflection of the slave rescue effort. It shows that slavery is more than just labor exploitation. It creates an environment that destroys humanity, turns people into commodities, and creates monsters like Patty Cannon. Second, it is a warning about the dangers of ignoring and depriving a group of people of their human rights. Patty Cannon was able to thrive for 2 decades not because she was so smart, but because society chose not to care about her victims. Government indifference and racial prejudice created an invisible shield that protected the crime. Third, this story has become a classic case study in criminology about how criminal organizations can exploit the gray areas of the law to operate. Patty Cannon's story forces us, as people of the 21st century, to ask ourselves, does our society today really protect the most vulnerable? Or are legal loopholes and social indifference still creating dens for modern-day monsters? Ultimately, as we tell this story, the most important thing is not to remember the name Patty Cannon. The names of the perpetrators are often remembered, while the names of the victims are forgotten. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people were kidnapped and their lives were ruined by this gang. These men, women, and children had names, families, and dreams, but most of their names have been erased from history, leaving only cold statistics. The purpose of turning this dark page is to remember them, to acknowledge their pain, and to ensure that the indifference that allowed this crime to happen will never be repeated. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey. What do you think is the biggest lesson we can learn from Patty Cannon's criminal empire? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our conversation is a way to keep the victims' memories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more forgotten stories, because understanding the past is the best way to protect the future. See you soon.